Greetings, ladies and metal gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Something, written by RoyalHyacinthus. In the beginning, there was nothing. At the end, there is nothing. Nothing had never been, but then nothing had never been before. As nothing continued to not be, however, it slowly discovered something it was. Completely and utterly bored. Not only was there nothing to do, there was nothing to see, nothing to play with, and nothing to entertain itself. So, the part that was bored decided to become something again, just to liven up the place a bit. At first, something was almost as bored as when it was nothing. The only change, what there was now something to become. Might as well do that, it would have grumbled to itself. Unfortunately, it hadn't yet created the idea of speaking or complaining, as it wandered towards the ultimate goal of being not quite so devastatingly bored. The first concepts popped into existence. Oh sure, cut in line, it wasn't like I was here first or anything. Aware of each other, but of something. These concepts quickly got to their own business and became things. Time, gravity, space, matter. Each aspect came together and decided what the place really needed was more. It didn't matter what, just more of it, and pronto. But even at the very beginning, group work was rigged. Gravity and matter worked together to make the elements, planets, galaxies, weaving the fabric of reality itself. Time and space just kind of stood around and poked them until they were done. Yeah, I mean, space made the void, but there's just a rip-off version of nothing, isn't it? And don't get me started on time. I made seconds and hours. What's that? The units of time? Well, whoop-de-doo. Maybe I should cut off some hair and call it squeak fork. It would be about the same amount of effort. I mean, really. You're a founding tenet of the universe. Put some elbow grease into it. Where was I? Oh yes, the creation of the universe. Oh man, just wait until I get into the Twaniverse. Shit gets wild. These new things started interacting and building off of each other, just as the predecessors had. However, they saw the place was getting quite full of things and decided some nice stuff would be a welcome addition instead. This was a completely arbitrary distinction, but they felt it would help pad out their resume whenever they got around to creating whatever the hell that was. Arbitrary distinction in mind, oceans, earth, energy, and every other thing started in on their new idea. There was just one problem. While stuff could and certainly would interact with each other, joining wasn't the only thing they did. Some stuff were more happy being nothing. Some hated other stuff with a passion, and yet most decided the whole combining nonsense was beneath them. They would complain to their creators about the awful, horrible stuff other things had made, causing debates over who needed to change what. Some of these were cordial enough. Others caused primordial soup to be launched at the faces with the primordial spoons. But as their fights continued and grew ever more intense, a new thing was created, so quietly that only nothing noticed. Conflict, change, competition, evolution, all in one being, an aspect of something that had no name for the moment, but would later be known by their most famous moniker, war. War quickly set to work, inflaming arguments and prodding sides until things and stuff were beating each other back into nothing. War told matter that energy said their ass looked fat. Matter was deeply offended and hurt, despite having no idea what either of those words meant. War told oceans that Earth thought liquids were tacky. The first tears in the universe appeared in their eyes, created purely out of spite. War even went so far as to tell space that time said that it was vapid and empty. Huffing and fuming, space exploded at time with a moderate pop. However, this set off all the other stuff and things who jumped at the opportunity to just start beating the crap out of each other. This quickly got something's attention, who was not pleased that the only form of entertainment around was busy tearing itself apart. "Oi!" it said. The fighting continued. "Oi!" It tried again, a bit louder this time. Time stopped, but when this froze everything into place, it did the conceptual equivalent of a shrug, then got back to beating space over the head with a very anachronistic folding chair. Something sighed, then pulled out the big guns. "Nothing. Can you get in here and help me? I need you to scare them for a second," replied Nothing. "No, I don't need a hard reset. Just a concept only you can create," said Nothing, rather reluctantly. "Look, I'm not going to use him unless they keep fighting, and then they're nothing anyway. Come on, he's probably bored in there," proclaimed Nothing. And for a second, the place froze in its entirety. Everything and all the stuff they had created was suddenly reminded that, at their core, they were nothing and would one day return to it. Thus, the first universal constant was formed. If it exists, it'll feel existential dread. Always. It never stops. Not for a single moment, even for puppies. Especially for puppies. Looking out, everything saw what Nothing had created. The concept was physical, dressed all in black, somehow seeming to watch in every direction, unperturbed by the attention. The figure waved his skeletal hand. A booming voice rang out from everywhere and nowhere, all at the same time. "Hello, my name is Something, and I'd like to introduce you to your new cousin. Say hello to Death." Everything said a polite greeting, followed by their individual stuff. Time pulled out a sand hourglass and tossed it over, which Death caught, nodding an acknowledgement. They had been, would be the best of partners, after all. "It has come to my attention that you are in fact infants. While I can quite literally only blame myself for this, I'm still not letting you destroy yourselves in a universal temper tantrum. Therefore, I've done two things. The first is that I've gotten you a babysitter." Death flipped the hourglass over, pointing at the falling sand. He tapped it in a way that seemed to say, "Your bedtime will come someday." "The second is that I've added a new rule. Only Death can destroy things. You are limited to transforming stuff. Any attempts to break this rule will be met with a reality-shattering spanking by me, then a timeout with Uncle Nothing. Forget a moderate pop. I'll make a large but still moderately sized kaboom. Understand?" Everything did the conceptual equivalent of rapid nodding. Death looked over at Time with his version of an exasperated sigh, while Time winked back. They both knew what was coming. "Good. Now play nice and handle your toys with a bit more respect. I've got something to do." And with that, their creator popped out of the place. Everything stared at Death pensively, waiting to see if the first action this alien concept would take. Death silently rolled his shoulders, pulled out his scythe, and went over to some stuff that had been begging to go back into nothing. With a single tap, it became a glowing orb, kaleidoscoped by whirling display of colors and shapes. This he handed back to Energy with a tilt of his head that seemed to say, "Creating stuff outside the bounds of reality rarely ends well." What's reality? Good question. Go figure it out. He then went over to some other stuff. Its name was Noble Gas, and it had been a non-stop whinging about having to combine since the moment it was created. He bonked it on the head with the heft of his scythe as to say, "Good news! You can be by yourself. In fact, please do that." Thus the second universal constant was formed. Nothing, not even Nothing, likes a whiny little baby, especially when they're pretentious enough to call themselves noble or something just as equally dumb. Like naming a small unit of time a second instead of a squig fork, just for example. And with that, the spell was broken. Things got back to altering and experimenting with their stuff, creating wilder and more expressive versions that better demonstrated their own personality. Some of the more active ones would call out to Death, asking for his guidance on how a viable new creation would be. Some stuff would get an approving nod, others would receive a long, slow shake for no, and still others would have him scratch his head with a skeletal digit. These he stuck around for, always watching to make sure everything in the place was content with what it was to be. Some experiments would turn out fine, others would fail and be instantly removed, but there was a constant for everything Death was unsure of. War would appear right alongside him. Eventually, this made Death curious. He extended a hand in a way that seemed to say, "Well?" "One of these is going to be an issue," said War. "Something will change, and I want to be right in the middle of it." Death patted his scythe in a way that seemed to say, "Every problem has a solution. And if it keeps making problems, then I'm sure you'll be entertained. It's not like I'm going anywhere. Years passed, and Death eventually grew quite close with some things. Time was obviously a top contender, but war, oceans, and energy slowly won him over with the flexible nature of their creations. Oceans in particular he adored. When asked about it after a dive in the very bottom of their deepest sea, he hugged himself as to say, "It reminds me of home." The other things grew more and more distant from him. They were simply more independent or preferred the input of their fellow things over an outsider. Matter was the oldest member of this group, so it was to Death's surprise when they called him over alongside Oceans and Energy. "We have an idea," began Oceans. "I'd like to take some of my most basic building blocks and put them into an environment where they can combine," continued Matter. "Really simple stuff, make it almost impossible for them not to latch onto each other. And then I'll give them a push they need to keep growing together. It'll be self-replicating stuff," Energy finished brightly. At this, Death went stock still. He looked over with his version of a sorrowful gaze at Time, who pointed at the hourglass on his hip. There was something just as inevitable as both of them. Death slowly nodded. As the three began their work, he did something he had never done before. He directly involved himself with the creation of new stuff. He altered it, shaped its form, gave it limitations and flaws invisible to anyone but himself. And then he elevated it. Not mere stuff, not quite a thing, but something in between. As it watched, something nodded approvingly. It was finally time to liven up the place. Death, Energy, Matter, Oceans all stood and waited to see what results their experiment would have. War appeared silently behind Death, just as he always has. But nothing happened. Death knocked himself on the head, waving Time over to add a final ingredient. As his friend finished, Death heard a pop as life sprang into being next to him. Death looked down as if to say, "Hello, old friend." Life waved microscopically as if to say, "Morning already." End of story. I would just like to thank the T5 supporters: Bushmaster 117, Casper Arnholtz, Draxzoon WRE, Elijah Silvercross, Gray, John Carrington, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.